Hello, biology. The purpose of this video is to give students who were absent an opportunity to get caught up on the notes. Also, it's possible that we did not finish these notes in class this week. Therefore, you'll need to go to the end to get the rest of the notes. Please remember to number them appropriately. We left off at number 14 and 17-1. Therefore, we're starting with number 15. For those of you that are doing a Google Doc, we are going to number 33. So 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So you are going to need 19 rows and 2 columns. And of course, remember to do these in Cornell Note style. Also, if you are choosing to mutiny, that's totally fine. Just understand that I'll be going to the next slide when I point, just like always, so you don't necessarily have to hear me to know when to pause the video. Of course, I am going to be going faster than I do in class because it's a video and because you can pause it when you wish. All right, here we go. 17-2 talks about how we think life on this planet began. And of course, evolution suggests that all living things on this planet came from those first organisms. But it wasn't quite that simple. Not a snap of a finger and we got an organism. We had to start with what organisms are made of. All right, here we go. There's not a lot of evidence for the history of life because most of it, if there were fossils that were formed, most of it is extremely old, about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years old, and it's very possible that those fossils were destroyed. All right, Earth was not born in a single event. Matter of fact, I believe we are going to watch a movie that talks about the steps involved with how life might have formed, and that's referred to as abiogenesis. What we think the early Earth's atmosphere was, we're going to abbreviate atmosphere as capital AS. Probably hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, which is, of course, what makes up the majority of the atmosphere right now, hydrogen sulfide, and water or water vapor. All right, moving ahead. All right, Earth's crust. Remember, the entire surface of the Earth is covered by rock. Now, granted, the oceans are over some of that oceanic crust, but remember, the entire surface is covered by solid rock. We think that about 4 billion years ago, or basically about 500 million years after the formation of the Earth, it was cool enough to allow for the water vapor that was in the atmosphere to condense and form liquid water. Oh, beg your pardon. There's more. Yeah, so about 3.8 billion years ago is when the surface was cool enough to allow for water vapor to condense into liquids. 4 billion years ago, the magma that would have been on the surface started to solidify because the radioactive energy in the inside of the planet sufficiently dropped to allow solid rock to form. And remember, the idea is that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years, so this would have been about 800 million years ago. After the formation of the Earth was when the oceans formed, and about 600 million years for the crust to form. All right, moving ahead. All right, please use this as an opportunity to practice with your notes. The Earth's crust formed about how many billion years ago, while the oceans formed about how many billion years ago? Take a look back to number 18. Yeah, so crust, 4 billion years ago. Oceans, 3.8 billion years ago. True or false, there is an extensive amount of evidence suggesting what the early Earth was like. Take a look back at number 18, 15, I'm a little tired. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of evidence, so really it's difficult to try to figure out exactly what happened. We got good ideas, but they're just ideas. All right. Could organic molecules or molecules that are needed for life have evolved on the early planet? Yeah, there was a famous experiment by Miller and Urey that simulated the conditions that would have been necessary in a lab. And there is evidence of what the early Earth's atmosphere was like, what types of compounds would have existed. And of course, they needed to know that to simulate what was happening on the early planet. So their experiments showed how mixtures of organic compounds necessary for life could have come from simpler compounds that would be found on a primitive planet. And the video that we will watch later this week will walk into that too. All right, y'all. Moving ahead, here's what the apparatus looked like. Okay. So you got water vapor here. It's being heated by a Bunsen burner, and that's turning it into steam or water vapor, which would have been in the early Earth's atmosphere. And then you mix in some of the gases that I had mentioned back in number 17. Those would have been the types of gases that would have been found on the early planet. And then that mixture moves into a chamber where it gets a spark. And of course, the spark electricity, there is natural electricity in the form of lightning, and there would have been lightning strikes on the planet at that time. So the idea is that this lightning strikes this pool of water and gas mixture. Condensation chamber, that's where you cool it down. That makes droplets form, so whatever microscopic molecules are in that gas mixture collects in the water droplet and then moves down to this flask. And they found amino acids and other organic compounds from this reaction, proving that you could get molecules, at least, that are involved in living things from non-living things. Of course, there were a few more steps before we got to the first cells, etc. All right, DNA and RNA evolution. Some RNA sequences actually help DNA replicate, and that is a big reason why some people think that RNA would have been the first hereditary molecule on the planet. Some RNA molecules can grow and duplicate themselves, which again suggests that maybe RNA was here before DNA was. All right, moving ahead. All right, what natural event supplied the spark to generate amino acids and other compounds in Miller and Urey's experimental setup? You might want to take a look back. Well, take a look back at the. Never mind. You didn't draw the structure. Come on, what was that stuff? Yeah, it's lightning. Okay. All right. What two things is RNA able to do, suggesting that it might have existed before DNA? So take a look back at number 21, of course. Yeah, so RNA can help DNA replicate, and RNA can duplicate itself, suggesting it might have been the first nucleic acid on the planet. Because remember, Na stands for nucleic acid. All right, here we go. All right, the oldest fossils on Earth, they're microscopic. We call those microfossils. They're single-celled organisms like modern bacteria, and we found those in rocks over 3.5 billion years old. The video that we watch later on, we'll talk about stromatolites, the actual rock structures that have these microfossil evidence. And we have found rocks as old as 3.5 billion years ago with those fossils in it, meaning that life began at least 3.5 billion years ago. Could have been older, but maybe those fossils just don't exist. It was oxygen. We're going to abbreviate it O2. There for these bacteria, no, there was no oxygen in the primitive atmosphere. Oxygen, we believe, arrived about 2.2 billion years ago. And the evidence we have for that is we actually have rocks that have iron oxide, rust, in them that are about 2.2 billion years old. And you get rust. Now, a lot of people think that water is necessary for rust to form. It's not. Water speeds up the process, but all that is necessary for iron to rust is oxygen, in the presence of oxygen. So we know that these rocks were in the presence of oxygen, and that was about 2.2 billion years ago. We're going to abbreviate capital PS for photosynthetic. Bacteria began producing oxygen in the oceans, and then, of course, it bubbled up to the surface, and it started to move into the atmosphere. All right, you guys, moving ahead. All right, then what? So oxygen was actually toxic for some life forms, so that led to a mass extinction. Other organisms obviously survived because we still have life today, but they evolved metabolic pathways. Metabolism is how your body processes things. Metabolic pathways to use oxygen for respiration. And of course, a lot of people think that humans, oh yeah, we need oxygen to live. No, specifically, we need oxygen so we can convert our food that we eat into ATP energy, which is the energy that cells use. So in the presence of oxygen, glucose, which is the base of all food chains, gets broken down into ATP. So that's why we need oxygen. So we inhale it through our lungs, then it diffuses into our bloodstream, and then a bloodstream takes it to the places where the energy is going to be needed and also brings glucose there, and that's how you get ATP. But it was toxic for some life forms. So some organisms did not survive. Others that could adapt and I don't want to say figure out how to use oxygen, they just simply started using oxygen. All right, so the endosymbiotic theory is the fact that eukaryotic cells, which are the more complex cells, abbreviated EC, they have organelles, they have a nucleus, that they came from living communities formed by prokaryotic. Those are the other types of cells. We're talking like bacteria, algae, simple one-celled. They do have DNA, but it's not enclosed in a nucleus. It's kind of unorganized. Oh no, the dog's going to start barking. Those are simpler cells with no nucleus. And I'll get into specifically, what that looks like. I've got some images in these notes to show you. All right, so the endosymbiotic theory explained. Hold on a second. I'm going to fix this real quick. Sorry. Just give me just a moment. That's better, I think. There we go. Yeah. All right, so the endosymbiotic theory explained that about 2 billion years ago, oh goodness, there he goes. There's obviously a dog outside. Prokaryotic organisms evolved internal cell membranes. They had a membrane on the outside, but they started to develop internal cell membranes, which allows for organelles, the organs of cells that do things for the cell, kind of like what organs do for our body. So they are the ancestors of all eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells form from a symbiosis between many prokaryotic organisms, many single-celled, simple, primitive organisms. Oh, sorry about that. Moving ahead. All right, so here's what it looked like. So we had a prokaryote here, all right? And then we had some aerobic bacteria, which means bacteria that can survive and use oxygen. Okay, aerobic exercise is when you need a lot more oxygen. So what happened is they started getting engulfed by this larger prokaryotic cell. And the idea is that aerobic bacteria that can survive conditions of oxygen and know how to use oxygen to create energy started living inside of this, and that eventually they became the mitochondria, which is plural for mitochondrion, and the mitochondria is where our cellular respiration takes place. So oxygen and glucose go through a reaction and they get ATP energy. They produce water vapor and carbon dioxide after that reaction. And then, of course, whenever we exhale the carbon dioxide and the water vapor. So oxygen for cell respiration, we inhale it. Obviously, we eat our food, and then we exhale the products of that reaction, which are carbon dioxide and water vapor. So that's the idea of where mitochondria came from. Now, plants and other photosynthetic organisms also have mitochondria, but they get their chemical energy in the form of glucose through photosynthesis. The idea is that there was a photosynthetic bacteria that got engulfed by this other prokaryote, and basically, what the larger cell, they're getting energy. Okay, that's what symbiosis means. It means it's a relationship between the two. These guys are getting energy in the form of ATP, which is what cells need, and the aerobic bacteria are getting a place to live. So they're getting shelter. Same thing here. These guys produce the chemical energy, glucose, for the cell, and then they also get shelter or a place to stay. So this is kind of what where we think chloroplasts, which are the photosynthetic organelles, and mitochondria came from. And these are individual membrane-bound organisms living inside, which eventually, we believe, led to the first eukaryotic cell. And of course, all cells in humans are eukaryotic. All right, mitochondrial evolution, just talked about this. Prokaryotes that use oxygen to generate energy-rich molecules of ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. That is the energy cells need. We believe they evolved into our current cells, mitochondria. All right, moving ahead. Like chloroplast, very similar. Prokaryotes that carried out photosynthesis evolved into chloroplasts. All right, moving ahead. All right, how old are the oldest examples of living things on planet Earth? Might want to take a look back at number 22. Yeah, the fossils that we find are about 3.5 billion years old. So it took about 1.1 billion years after the Earth formed for the first life forms to evolve. When did oxygen begin to be added to the atmosphere? Can't remember. Take a look back at number 24. Yeah, 2.2 billion years ago. So basically about half of the age of the Earth. The endosymbiotic theory suggests that ATP-producing prokaryotes evolved into blanks, while photosynthetic prokaryotes evolved into blanks. Take a look at number 28 and 29. Yeah, mitochondria and chloroplasts are what go into those two blanks. All right, here we go. Let's finish these up. All right, prokaryote reproduction. Or how do prokaryotes reproduce? They use asexual reproduction, basically mitosis and cloning. So similar to our body cells, not our sex cells, not our sperm cells and our egg cells, but they use mitosis, exact copy. Okay, but you also are limited, and we'll get to this. You're limited to mutations for your genetic variation because there's no crossing over. Remember, crossing over takes place in prophase 1 when gametes are being formed. So if you're not using sexual reproduction, you're not going to get the crossing over opportunity. So the daughter cells are exact copies of the parent cells. And like I just said, genetic variation is limited to mutations in DNA only. All right. Moving ahead. Benefits of sexual reproduction. Obviously, you have the opportunity to shuffle genes in each generation, which adds to genetic variation. Increased probability of good traits appearing. Increased chance of natural selection leading to evolution. And of course, it leads to to stronger populations. I mean, if you have a lot more genetic variation in a changing environment, and trust me, the environment's changing in most places, you're better able to survive. All right, moving ahead. What is the only source of genetic variation in asexually reproducing prokaryotes? Take a look back at number 31. Yeah, so they're just limited to the mutations that occur during DNA replication, because mitosis does not use crossing over. Well, it's not that meiosis uses crossing over. Meiosis has the opportunity for crossing over, not mitosis. With sexual reproduction, there's an increased probability of blank combinations and of evolutionary change due to blank blank. You might want to take a look at number 32 and 33. Yeah, higher probability of different gene combinations and evolutionary change due to natural selection. All right. Which of the following gases was probably not present in the early atmosphere? Hydrogen cyanide, oxygen, nitrogen, or carbon monoxide? Yeah, it's oxygen. Oxygen didn't get here until about 2.2 billion years ago. Miller and Urey's experiment was a simulation of Earth's early volcanic activity, formation, atmosphere, or life. Yeah, it simulated the early Earth's atmosphere, which is where they got the inorganic compounds and molecules necessary for the organic molecules, amino acids, to come from. As concentrations of oxygen rose in the ancient atmosphere of Earth, organisms began to evolve anaerobic pathways. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Plasma membranes, metabolic pathways that used oxygen, or photosynthesis. Yeah, so they started to be able to use oxygen to get energy for their cells, ATP energy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the notes. We will see you in the Zoom.